A bad omen and sign of a bubble, Blackrock and Vanguard dive into the dark world of private equity. Today we'll be talking about the recent announcements in February that mutual fund giant Vanguard has entered into the dark world private equity. What is so bad about this? What is such a bad omen about Vanguard getting into the private equity business? And what is so bad about private equity anyway?
Okay, well, first of all, our viewers need to know exactly what the private equity leveraged buyout business is. Simply put, private equity is when you have an investment partnership, generally started by some billionaire, puts up a little sliver of his own money and gets most of its seed money or investment capital from limited partners, from kind of dumb money like public pensions, college endowments, and so on. And then the private equity manager goes on to buy a company mostly with debt. And it's not unusual for in a private equity or leveraged buyout transaction for 80% or more of the company is to be purchased with additional debt. When investment managers such as Vanguard or Blackrock get into this type of finance, a red warning flare should go up to everybody, particularly the Main Street investors. The fact of the matter is they are acquiring companies that were generally once 80% equity and 20% debt. They buy them in a leveraged buyout private equity transaction, and now they're 80% debt and only 20% equity. This is not a good omen, and it's definitely a sign of a bubble.
That does not sound too bad. When people purchase a home, they generally put down 20% deposit to purchase a home, and financing 80% of the purchase price with debt is commonplace. What is so bad about that?
Well, on the surface, like everything else, it looks okay. The problem is when you look underneath the waves, it's like an iceberg when you look at what's below it. First off, when you purchase your home, you are responsible for the mortgage and paying the debt. However, in the private equity transaction, they're using the company balance sheet to purchase the company. And then the company they just acquired is now paying the debt. And secondly, when you purchase a company with so much debt, you place a great deal of stress on any company. This will happen to any family or business if you put too much debt. This is why private equity transactions are called leveraged buyouts, because they're purchased with lots of debt. Now the company's got more debt to service, the company becomes weakened because of the massive interest costs, and with lots of debt, companies often end up in bankruptcy. And economic carnage, asset stripping, economic stress is commonplace in these transactions and this corner of Wall Street, which has gone from a little sliver of Wall Street to a giant piece of it. Because the company needs to service massive amounts of debt, pensions get terminated, research and development is scaled back, assets are sold off and sold for cash, and there's a lot of economic carnage. Next, really, the private equity leverage buyout deals are very complex transactions. We're giving more and more fees to Wall Street. Now they're doing this for Vanguard and Blackrock, and we'll see. We're tying up people's money for very long periods of time. It's another rich day, payday for Wall Street, and the money managers make out, and the tax benefits they get are astronomical and outrageous. What is disgusting about the private equity manager who's putting up the deal is frequently has little of his own money in the game. If the investment goes into default, a debt for equity swap, or goes bankrupt, the private equity manager really has little skin of his own money in the game.
This does not sound too good. Vanguard has always trumpeted itself as the simple-to-understand, low-cost retirement plan provider. But what it sounds like, just another way for Vanguard or others to gamble with your money with little personal skin in the game. Is this really happening?
Well, this is Wall Street, and Wall Street investing, it's always the continuing trend to gamble with other people's money is greater than ever. If the private equity leveraged buyout transaction goes bust and the investment implodes, it's other people's money, not the private equity manager. This is not good. And what you're seeing is that private equity is dying to get into the retail investor space. This is not a good omen for the Main Street investor. It means more complexity, more fees, no guarantees, and long lockup periods. Vanguard, who admitted its partnership the other week with Boston-based private equity firm HarborVest Partners, has been looking to get into the space for 2 decades, but really this has been accelerated.
This does not sound good for the average retail investor. Are there other mutual fund companies getting into this in addition to Vanguard? If so, what has been their success rate?
Well, yeah, the giant of indexing asset manager BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, and Invesco to a certain extent are two other companies which are notably in this space. But if you want to look at, I like to look at history. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Let's look at the 2006 transaction. In 2006, mutual fund giant BlackRock teamed up with the New York real estate investor Tishman Speyer to purchase Peter Cooper Village, the by Bedford-Stuyvesant town in Manhattan. It's a 40-building complex with 11,000 apartments on the East River, New York. It was a $1.5 billion leveraged buyout transaction, and this program ended up being a disaster by the masters of the universe, BlackRock and Tishman Speyer. Saddled with so much debt and an inability to charge higher rents on rent-controlled places, they ended up hundreds of millions of interest expense, and Peter Cooper Village, Bedford-Stuyvesant town, collapsed into default in 2010. They lost more than $2 billion. This is just a decade ago, and but the other losses incurred by BlackRock and Tishman Speyer included CalPERS, the giant pension fund, the ultimate chump, lost $500 million. CalSTRS, the giant California teachers pension fund, lost $100 million. The state of Florida lost $250 million. The sovereign wealth fund of Singapore lost around $100 million. And the Church of England, they even took the Church of England for like $70 million. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had something like $2 billion invested in this deal. And I still don't understand how they did this to this day.
Is BlackRock, the mutual fund giant who did this Peter Cooper Village deal, doing any more of these debt-propelled deals?
Answer, yes. Unfortunately, memories are short on Wall Street, and BlackRock, which now manages $7.2 trillion, is continuing to gamble other people's money. In a desperate search for yield, BlackRock entered into a transaction called they purchased Authentic Brands for $4.2 billion in August of 2019, putting roughly down $875 million of their money or other people's money, and they financed the rest of this transaction with debt. A lot of people don't know who BlackRock is, but Authentic Brands is. But Authentic Brands is the company that owns a lot of the dead celebrities' brands, such as Muhammad Ali, Marilyn Monroe, and Michael Jackson. And the company also includes a lot of numerous consumer brands like Fredericks of Hollywood, Nine West, and Aeropostale, which, believe it or not, they acquired out of bankruptcy. But you need a little history. BlackRock purchased majority stakes of Authentic Brands from Leonard Green and Partners, a private equity firm out of Los Angeles. But memories are short on Wall Street. In 2016, Leonard Green put the giant sports retailer headquartered out of Denver into bankruptcy. I guess like 14,000 people lost jobs, something of that nature. And recently, Leonard Green and its other private equity partner, TPG, also known as Texas Pacific Group, put Savers, who resells items donated by charity, into a nasty debt for equity swap in March of 2019. Essentially another bankruptcy.
Sounds like private equity has a lot of downsides, but giant Wall Street money managers like Vanguard and BlackRock do not want their customers to understand that they are engaged in this type of work finance. Does that sound correct? What should Main Street investor concerns be?
Well, yeah, the answer, there's a lot of huge risks in private equity, and this is definitely another sign of a bubble that we're coming to the top of a bubble. The problem with private equity, and I've done a lot of research, the investments are generally very risky. The investments are generally highly illiquid. They have high management fees. They have high monitoring fees. They have fees upon fees. They have huge debt payments, and they lack transparency. So, and then also, there's lots of generally giant conflicts of interest in private equity. Most deals are done in secrecy, and when people do things in secrecy, they usually have something to hide. Managers who own limited partnership shares of the actual investors themselves, such as like CalPERS, are frequently bound to non-disclosure agreements, so they can't talk about the investments they're in. And then people can be locked in these benefits, these limited partnership agreements in private equity for years. I call it Hotel California money. You can enter it anytime you like, but you can never leave. These are some of the other problems with private equity.
What details should investors know about private equity? It does not sound good overall. What should Main Street be concerned about?
Well, Main Street investors, whether they like it or not, they're already involved in the private equity leverage buyout in a very big way, although 99% of the population does not know this. But asset managers like Vanguard really don't let people know about it. They don't go out and tell people, this is really tragic. For instance, let's make a hard fact. Blackstone LP, which is the largest private equity firm in the world, I don't know, $430 billion in assets, the number one shareholder of this large private equity firm is Vanguard. And other giant mutual fund companies like Capital World of American Funds, Janus Henderson, Wellington, which is kind of the back office of Vanguard in active management, Morgan Stanley and others own a huge chunk of the company. Let's give another example. Another example is KKR, the private equity leverage buyout firm that brought you The Barbarians of the Gate. They did a movie about these guys and wrote a book about these guys. This is a giant fiasco, the leverage buyout of R.J. Nabisco. Again, KKR, the major shareholders are Vanguard, Principal, T. Rowe Price, Blackrock, and Fidelity. And another example is Ares Management, which is another giant private equity firm out of Los Angeles. The major shareholders of Ares Management are Capital World, American Funds, Vanguard again, Blackrock, Wellington, which is part of Vanguard, and Invesco. So BlackRock itself it was once part of the private equity Blackstone LP back going around in the 1980s. But like other private equity firms, BlackRock, which is a mutual fund giant itself, is owned by other people's money, such as PNC Bank, Vanguard, BlackRock. So the shares of other investors are invested in itself. A huge conflict of interest, and this is the same with State Street and other companies.
This all sounds very parasitic. Fund companies owning other fund companies. Fund owning private equity firms. Sounds gross, incestuous. You have constantly brought up the subject of bankruptcy when it comes to the subject of private equity. What should we be concerned about?
Well, first of all, let's look at the facts. We can see all these mutual fund giants, all of them are amassing trillions of dollars of other people's money. But they're parasites in a way because they own each other and they're now investing in bankruptcy in these transactions. There's been a lot of bankruptcies in recent years, and my research shows, and I would testify in a court of law of this, there's been over more than 300 major bankruptcies in the U.S. and abroad under the private equity leverage buyout model.
Are there any numbers that correlate to large bankruptcies and private equity, you ask?
Well, there's actually some great recent data. A company, according to a data provider called The Deal, roughly in 2019, 27% of all major bankruptcies could be traced to back to private equity leverage buyout ownership. In 2018, there was 28% of all these deals which went under the private equity leverage buyout model. And in 2017, there was 26.9% of all these private equity transactions involving major bankruptcies.
What should people do?
Well, first of all, people should start believing all index funds and ETFs are safe. They are not. Believe it or not. There's no guarantees. There's nothing. Nada. Index giants like State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock, which roughly own 80% of this space, and are investing in the private equity model, but they have no magic bullets for investors to get any additional yield. But they're gambling. People need to get an exit strategy out of a lot of this stuff before it blows up. If they have their funds in BlackRock, they need to take risk off the table. If you're in a totally passive strategy, which many people are, I guess most millennials are now, you need to protect what you have. This should be a red danger flares to anyone. Vanguard and BlackRock investing in private equity is not It's definitely another sign of a bubble. It is a canary in the coal mine. Call us for a second opinion. The only funds we want to help you with are the funds you don't want to lose. Contact us at barryjamesdyke.com or camnh.com.